This is lecture 47B, The Empire Strikes Back Against Paraguay, continuation of what we did in the last lecture. This time it's about the origin and evolution of the capitalist stage, and we'll take our beginning in 1824 with the perfecting of the modern state apparatus by Mr. Francia. And when I was writing this, I was going back and forth to the Netflix show called The Borgias with Jeremy Iron and Holiday Granger, and I couldn't help but be reminded, especially we're talking about Paraguay, of a rather humorous incident that occurred at the aduana, that is the customs at the Asuncion airport one time when I was going through there. As you may know, or maybe you don't know, but at any rate, the customs are always a place where you've got cops hanging around to make some money. And that's the same for secret policemen as everybody else. And I remember one time coming through there, and I was an obvious gringo. Of course, we all looked the same to them. Fortunately, they didn't have these facial identification computer programs at that time. So one of these kids was looking at me, and he said something like, "Lucia," the CIA, and I just kind of winked at him in a knowing way, like, "Yeah, you got it, and you're right." Well, he was really happy over that, and I thought at the time I would just shine him on that way, but he decided he wanted to carry my bags and so on as we left the airport, and so I told him, I'm going to need a driver for a few days. And boy, he was happy about that. He took me to the hotel that he thought I should go to, and I gave him $100 bills to get him started, which was a lot of money in those days in Paraguay. Exactly what these cops are hanging around to get. Find some gringo that'll put him on the gravy train for a few days. So this didn't last too long. A few days I was done, and I got out of there. One of the reasons I was in a hurry was because I knew this kid was going to have to brag to his colleagues about this, and as soon as he did, that this word would get back to the real CIA man, and he was going to end up in the river there in the same way that so many people in that Borgias ends up in the Tiber River. At any rate, humorous incidents like this happen from time to time. Shows that you have to have the right kind of personality for this sort of work. Now, this Paraguayan secret service began as a system of internal espionage, and in this way he presaged, Francia did, many of the developments in modern capitalist states. The subversive latifundistas could be arrested without charge in his reign and disappeared without trial. Torture in Francia's chamber of truth was applied to those suspected of plotting to overthrow him, kind of like that Naples operation you see in the Borgias. This put a chill on the always plotting would-be royalists. And as if that wasn't enough, Francia soon let it be known that political prisoners from the old ruling classes would find themselves in a detention camp, not a pleasant place when shackled in dungeons, denied medical care, and even basic sanitary facilities. These are places that, if you're lucky, they'll give you a shit bucket. Well, at any rate, in 1824, Francia's secret police uncovered and quickly crushed a plot by the elite to assassinate El Supremo. Francia then arrested almost 200 prominent Paraguayans, among whom were all the leading Criollo elite military figures of the 1811 independence revolt. And this is only a little over a decade later. Most of them were hung or shot. In 1821, Francia struck against the Spanish-born elite, summoning all of Paraguay's 300 or so peninsulares, that's Spaniards from the peninsular part of Spain, of the empire, the Iberian part of the empire, to Asuncion's main square. There he accused them of treason, had them arrested, held them in jail for 18 months, and they were released only after paying an enormous collective indemnity of 150,000 pesos. Which was also quite handy for Francia, as it was about 75% of his annual government budget. This amount was so large that it permanently broke the ability of his rich enemies to threaten his rule. Francia, like most Paraguayans, had mixed ancestry. His lack of pure European blood had been used to discriminate against him, and he decided to destroy the colonial racial hierarchy. Francia forbade Europeans from marrying other Europeans, thus forcing the elite to choose spouses from among the local population. Entry and exit passport control was introduced and enforced at the borders. Now, these decisions solidified Paraguayan identity. There were no longer separate racial identities. All Paraguayans had to live within the borders of Paraguay and build a new society. And thus today we have the modern Paraguayan society with equally powerful Hispanic and Guarani roots. Border and export-import controls destroyed exporters of yerba mate and tobacco, almost all of which had gone to foreign buyers. Kind of like Idaho potatoes used to all be shipped out of Idaho. If you were in Idaho, and you'd have a hard time getting yourself a big potato. Much to the anger of the local population, members of the former ruling class of Spanish or Spanish-descended church officials, military officers, merchants, and hacendados, or latifundistas, large landowners, took it in the ass, as they say, but these measures were extremely popular among the masses, and the government soon replaced this trade deficit with modern developed native industries in shipbuilding and textiles, a centrally planned and administered agricultural sector as well. New magnates and new-style agriboss latifundistas with diversified agricultural and cattle and sheep production replaced the export monoculture, as did a new ruling class of capitalist manufacturers and their proletarians. This would be the basis for Leninism when it arrived in 3/4 of a century. Targeting the church. One of Francia's special targets was the Roman Catholic Church. As it did everywhere in the world, the church had supported the oppression of the ruling slavocrats. It had provided the essential ideological support for Spanish rule by spreading the doctrine of the divine right of kings, the corollary being the inculcating of the native masses with a resigned fatalism about their social status, and it doomed them to accepting their economic subservience to their ruling masters. Accordingly, in 1824, Francia banned all religious orders, closed the only seminary in Paraguay. He ordered all monks and priests to be secularized, forcing them to swear loyalty to the nation, and he abolished the fuero ecclesiastico, the priests' and monks' privilege of clerical immunity from civil courts, confiscated church property, and subordinated church finances to government control. Of course, the Vatican would not tolerate this liberation of the colonial masses and their money. On the other hand, the common people benefited from the suppression of the traditional elites and from the expansion of the government's ownership. Why? Because Francia took land from the elite and their church and leased it to the poor farmers and ranchers at rates they could easily afford. For example, 875 families received homesteads from the lands of the former seminary. The various fines and confiscations levied on the elites helped to reduce the taxes for everyone else, and as a result, Francia's attacks on the elite and his state socialist policies provoked little popular resistance. The fines, expropriations, and confiscations of foreign-held property meant that the government quickly became the nation's largest landowner, eventually operating 45 animal breeding farms. The army soldiers ran these farms so well that surplus animals were given away to the small farmers. In summary, Francia was an extremely frugal and honest man. He left the state treasury with at least twice as much money in it as when he took office, including 36,500 pesos of his unspent salary, the equivalent of several years' salary. Francia's greatest accomplishment had been the preservation of Paraguayan independence. This was the lasting ramification of his non-interventionist, non-entanglement foreign policy. To counter Argentina as a potential threat to Paraguay, he quickly recognized Brazilian independence in 1822. At the same time, he had excellent relations with Juan Manuel Rosas, the Argentine boss. Now, Francia had prevented civil war, being promoted by would-be latifundista royalists when he cut off his internal enemies from their friends in Buenos Aires. He conducted a profitable but closely supervised import-export trade with both Argentina and Brazil to obtain arms and sell manufactured and agricultural agrarian products. This put Paraguay on the path of independent nationhood, and Paraguay's accomplishments during this period, including its existence as a nation, should be attributed to Francia's leadership. Now, the capitalist stage begins in Paraguay, the dawn of it formally. The rest of this transition from the feudal period that we were just talking about is a typical transition. If you go back and look at your textbook in the earlier chapters, and I think probably the earlier lectures too, you'll see I express this in the form of a quadratic equation, where simultaneously you have the ascending production equation of the new stage and the production equation of the outgoing stage at the same time. But what that means in practical terms, everyday terms, is that you're going to have features of both in the transitional period. Now we have the formal dawn of the capitalist period, and it begins in 1841 with the presidency of Carlos Antonio Lopez and lasts until 1862. After Francia's death in September 1840, a junta led by Manuel Antonio Ortiz took but could not cope with the power. So on January 22nd of 1841, Juan Jose Medina, who in turn was overthrown on February 9th of 1841 in a coup led by Mariano Roque Alonso, we went through a couple of these presidencies, which is the important thing here, not the names or the dates. But you can see that's one right after the other, a matter of months separating them. And for those months, chaos reigned in Asuncion, and on March 14, 1841, the two-man consulate of early independence era was recreated, and Alonso retired, and Carlos Antonio Lopez took over as co-consul. The second consulate lasted until March 13th of 1844, when Congress named Lopez the President of the Republic, and he remained president until his death many years later in 1862. Now, Lopez was a lawyer by training. He was one of the most educated men in Paraguay, and although Lopez's government was similar to Francia's, his appearance, style, and policies were different. Lopez used the all-powerful government and its state apparatus to enrich himself and his family. In contrast to the lean Francia, Lopez was obese. His appearance fit with his despotic nature, and he founded a dynasty and ran Paraguay as his personal fiefdom in the European style via Africa and Asia. Lopez soon became the largest landowner and cattle rancher in the country. He thus amassed a fortune augmented with profits from the government monopoly of the yerba mate trade, which he took completely for himself. He maintained that Paraguay prospered under the rule of El Excelentissimo, the most excellent one, as he called himself, and it was true that under Lopez, Paraguay's population did increase from about 220,000 in 1840 to 400,000 20 years later in 1860. Now, this reflected both the need of the latifundistas and the magnates for cheap labor, and the ability of Paraguayans to obtain their own food. Industrialists needed workers who could read, write, and handle arithmetic, and accordingly Paraguay made large strides in primary education. When Lopez took office, Asuncion had only one primary school. During his reign, more than 400 primary schools were built for over 25,000 primary students, and along the way the government accommodated the needs of the new teacher class and instituted secondary education. For higher education, Lopez paid for students to study abroad and sent secret policemen to watch over them, searching for those who might be infected with democratic ideas. In 1853, he sent his son Francisco Solano to Europe to buy guns. Competition from capitalists in Brazil and Argentina could easily lead to war between Paraguay, Brazil, or Argentina, so Lopez increased the regular army to 18,000 soldiers with a militia reserve of 46,000, and at that time Paraguay had the largest army in South America. British and other foreign technicians poured into the country to work on the creation of a military-industrial complex. The biggest project of the era was a huge fortress of Humaita, often called by military writers the Sevastopol of the Americas, to which highways and telegraph system Lake Asuncion. In 1858, a UK firm began building South America's first railroad, running from Asuncion to Paraguay. On September 22, 1861, the Central Railway Station opened in Asuncion. Foreign experts also helped build an iron foundry at Ibicuí and an armaments factory there. In 1842, they began the abolition of slavery, which had existed in Paraguay since early colonial times. The Europeans bought slaves to work as domestic servants. Conditions of life and work worsened for all slaves after 1700, however, and with the importation of about 50,000 African slaves to be used as agricultural workers and placed under the field overseers' whips. Under Francia, the state acquired about 1,000 slaves when it confiscated property from the elite. However, capitalism requires a quote-unquote free labor market, and the shackles of slavery had to go, and he enacted the 1842 law of the free womb, which ended the slave trade and guaranteed that the children of slaves would be free by age 25. The new law, of course, increased the slave population temporarily, and in the long term depressed slave prices as slave birth rates rose, and they were all destined to be free. You will note that this is 2 decades before the USA began its destruction of slavery. Now, in terms of foreign wars, initially Lopez feared an attack by the Buenos Aires dictator Rosas. With Brazilian encouragement, Lopez dropped Francia's policy of neutrality and began meddling in Argentine politics. Lopez declared war against Rosas in 1845 to support an unsuccessful rebellion in the Argentine province of Corrientes. Britain and France prevented Rosas from moving troops against Paraguay, but he was able to establish a trade embargo. Now, Rosas fell in 1852, and Lopez signed a treaty with the new government in Buenos Aires that recognized Paraguay's independence, and he then signed a treaty of friendship, commerce, and navigation with France. In 1853, the U.S. sent a warship, USS Water Witch, to Asuncion. A gringo sailor was killed. The U.S. had entered Paraguayan waters despite prohibition from Lopez, who quickly signed a treaty with Gringolandia of friendship to forestall U.S. retaliation. However, in 1858, the U.S. sent a flotilla to Paraguayan waters to claim compensation, and again, Lopez just as quickly agreed. Lopez allowed controversies and boundary disputes with Brazil and Argentina to smolder. The two giants had tolerated Paraguayan independence because Paraguay served to check the expansionist tendencies of each. Both were satisfied if the other could not dominate Paraguayan affairs. A Paraguay that was antagonistic to both Brazil and Argentina would give both countries a reason to get rid of him. In 1862, Francisco Solano Lopez became president, and he was president until 1870. He was selected by the Congress after his father's death, and to get this, he had to kill and jail hundreds of critics to secure his appointment. His government continued to exert control on all exports, especially the export of yerba mate and wood products, and his family members owned all the shops that produced these. Naturally, his Paraguayan government was extremely protectionist, and furthermore, it was self-financed. And Solano Lopez saw to it that the country never accepted loans from abroad. They maintained high tariffs against the importation of foreign products, and this avoided the debt suffered by Argentina and Brazil. The gringo bankers would not tolerate either his commercial protectionism nor his refusal to take their loans, and with the end of the U.S. Civil War, his days were numbered. Solano Lopez had had a pampered childhood. His father raised him to inherit his de facto throne, and accordingly he was a brigadier general at the age of 18. His 1853 trip to Europe to buy arms was probably the most important experience of his life. Like so many young men of his class and time, Solano Lopez admired the court of the French Empire of Napoleon III. And in Paris he fell in love with an Irish woman, Elisa Alicia Lynch. This was probably the first serious sexual experience of his life, and he brought her back to Asuncion with him. In Paraguay, her Parisian affectation made her popular, with much of the class of sycophants surrounding the Lopez family, but that meant she made enemies just as quickly, and Lynch bore Solano Lopez 5 sons and became the largest landowner in Paraguay after he transferred most of Paraguay and those properties he owned in Brazil into her name during the war. She married Solano Lopez with her own hands, or she buried Solano Lopez with her own hands after the last battle in 1870 and returned to Europe. Now, what war are we talking about? Well, it's called the War of the Triple Alliance, and this war resulted in the deaths of half of Paraguay's population. During the war, Solano Lopez ordered the executions of his own brothers and had his mother and sisters tortured for opposing the war. When thousands of people, including Paraguay's bravest soldiers and generals, went to their deaths before firing squads or were hacked to pieces on Solano Lopez's orders, the outside world came to think of him as a paranoid megalomaniac. The propaganda of his enemies in Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina was that he wanted to be the Napoleon of South America, and the war took 5 bloody, horror-filled years before Paraguay was defeated and Solano Lopez killed. Francisco Solano Lopez should have paid attention to his father's last words to avoid aggressive acts into foreign affairs, especially with Brazil, but instead he underestimated Paraguay's neighbors and overestimated his own abilities. He had no real grasp on the class politics involving in the neighboring countries, and much like politicians in Gringolandia today, lived in a narrative world of his own creation, which was increasingly less reflective of reality as the years had passed. Argentina and Brazil, for better or for worse, had clear identities. Brazil had a planter oligarchic government functioning. Argentina had a national regime of sorts and no longer reacted to the US-UK imperialist challenges as an assortment of squabbling regions. Paraguay, on the other hand, was in no way a power equal to Argentina or Brazil. Solano Lopez accurately assessed the September 1864 Brazilian intervention in Uruguay as a threat not only to Uruguay but to Paraguay as well, and he was also correct in his assumption that neither Brazil nor Argentina paid much attention to Paraguay's interests when formulating their policies. He was clear that preserving Uruguayan independence was crucial to Paraguay's future as a nation, and his plan? To start a Paraguayan third force between Argentina and Brazil, so Solano Lopez committed the nation to Uruguay's aid. Now, in early 1864, Lopez had warned Brazil against intervening in Uruguay's internal conflict, but they went ahead and did it anyway in September of 1864. In October of 1864 and November, Lopez ordered the seizure of Brazilian warships in the Paraguayan territorial waters, and he immediately followed this with an invasion of Mato Grosso province of Brazil in March of the following year, 1865, which temporarily worked. When Argentina refused Solano Lopez's request for permission for his army to cross Argentine territory to attack the Brazilian province of Rio Grande do Sul, Solano Lopez then started a war against Argentina. Now, you'll note that the Civil War in the U.S. has just ended. In May '65, signing by Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay of the Treaty of the Triple Alliance was inevitable once the historical stage had now been set, and these nations now undertook the complete destruction of the Solano Lopez regime. Paraguay was not prepared for this big war, although its 30,000-man army was the biggest in Latin America. But its strength was something else entirely. His neighbors knew that, and much of his pomp and ceremony parading the big army around Paraguay had been built for the purpose of illusion. Paraguay lacked the industrial base to replace weapons lost in battle. It had no reliable, long-term source of weapons or dependable reserves, and the Argentine-Brazilian alliance prevented Solano Lopez from receiving arms from abroad. Furthermore, his army actually lacked militarily competent leaders. Paraguay's population was only about 450,000 in 1865, a figure lower than the number of people in the Brazilian National Guard. Paraguay was a dwarf compared to the Triple Alliance partners, who had a total population of at least 11 million people. Marshal Solano Lopez, he made himself a marshal now, conscripted every able-bodied male over the age of 10 years old and forced women to perform all non-military labor, and still Paraguay could not field an army as large as the Alliance. The sorry course of the war and its blow-by-blow is beyond the scope of our interest. Suffice it to say the Paraguayans were slaughtered and the nation occupied. Now, under occupation, Paraguay was from 1869 to 1876. The Allies occupied Asuncion in 1869, and this put the victors in direct control of Paraguayan affairs. Argentina and Brazil swallowed 154,000 square kilometers of Paraguayan territory, and then I go through the treaties and so forth. But both Bolivia and Argentina went after the Gran Chaco. Paraguay lost its access to the Atlantic and indeed to the Rio de la Plata. Brazil lost 150,000 dead, 65,000 wounded, at a cost of US $200 million, ending up having to maintain the largest army of occupation. For what it was worth, Brazil controlled the economy and did so until 1876, when the occupying Brazilian troops finally left the country in midsummer. The Macayan-Irigoyen Treaty spelled out the particulars of the exit and Paraguay's future, and I go through that in your textbook, but for our purposes, just note that Paraguay did have fertile soil, so its farming people continued to subsist, as they had done for centuries, by eking out a meager existence under difficult conditions. And ownership of the agrarian estates and non-agrarian Paraguayan economy quickly passed to foreign speculators and adventurers. Until occupation, everything had been Lopez Solano gang owned, so it was quickly privatized and then bought out by Argentinian and British companies. Presiding over that rape was Juan Bautista Gil, who was rewarded by the Brazilian regime with the presidency of Paraguay from 1874 to 1877. There was a full transition under what was called the Legionnaires. Now, this was the anti-Lopez Paraguayan Legion that had been based in Buenos Aires, and it was mobilized by the Argentine regime in Buenos Aires to fight in Paraguay in the Triple Alliance War. In 1869, the survivors of that legion now took the reins in Asuncion as the provisional government. In origin, these legionnaires were refugees and exiles from Francia's day. Now, as Argentine surrogates in power, they abolished slavery and founded a new constitutional government, and naturally it was a government based on the liberal doctrine of rape and pillage capitalism. Everything for the rich, nothing for the poor, and of course free trade. And free trade in liberal terminology meant opening the economy to the hegemony of imperialism. Militia Chief General Benigno Ferreira was a de facto dictator until overthrown by Colorado Party boss, Bernardino Caballero in 1874 as the Brazilian candidate. The National Republican Association of the Colorado Party dominated Paraguayan political life from mid-1880s until the Liberal Revolution of 1904. Ferreira later returned to lead the 1904 Liberal Uprising, which ousted the Colorados, Ferreira taking the presidency between 1906 and 1908. Now we come to the entry of U.S. imperialism. In part 2 of this chapter, the first Colorado era occurs then between 1880 and 1904. In 1878, an international commission led by USA President Rutherford B. Hayes awarded Paraguay the disputed Chaco area between the Rio Verde and the Rio Pilcomayo. In his honor, the Presidente Hayes Department was created. In 1880, General Caballero seized power in a bloodless coup and dominated Paraguayan politics for most of the next 2 decades. The Gringo candidate brought political stability as guerrilla caudillo and as the 1887 organizer of the new Colorado Party, and under Gringo guidance he undertook the, quote, reconstruction, unquote, of Paraguay. The National University was founded in 1889 as the new order would need intellectuals properly trained, as in Gringolandia of that era, and however the manpower shortage was acute across the spectrum, as the census of 1887 proved. A total population now of 330,000 meant migration from abroad had to be encouraged. Now the farming masses are dispossessed, because furthermore, Paraguay was technically bankrupt, desperate for cash because of heavy debts incurred in London in the early liberal period. The Colorados lacked a source of funds except through the sale of the government's vast holdings. More than 95% of Paraguay's total land area was owned by the government, although the regular farming people did not know this and considered the land they worked as their own. Nevertheless, Caballero's government sold much of this land to foreigners in huge lots. So while Colorado politicians raked in the profits and themselves became large landowners, peasant squatters who had farmed the land for generations were forced to vacate, and many had to flee the country one step ahead of the sheriff. By 1900, 79 people owned half of the country's land. Kind of like you see in the Robin Hood movies with the absence of King John. At any rate, the liberals had advocated, the Liberal Party people, the same land policy as the Colorado Party people, but the masses were unaware of all of this, and the unpopularity of the sales and the blatant evidence of pervasive government corruption produced a tremendous outcry from the masses and now from the political opposition to the Colorados, and accordingly, liberals became bitter foes of selling land, especially after Caballero rigged the 1886 election to ensure the victory for General Patricio Escobar. Ex-legionnaires, idealistic reformers, and former Lopezistas joined in July 1887 to form the Centro Democrático, the Democratic Center. This was the precursor of the Liberal Party. Its principal program was, of course, an end to land sales, perhaps negation of those already done, free elections, civilian control over the military, and naturally that old trusted and true standby, clean government. The two-party system Paraguayan style. So, Caballero, Jose Segundo Descud, and Escobar responded, forming the Colorado Party 1 month later. The Paraguayan two-party system thus came into existence, and both parties had internal divisions and very little ideology separated them, allowing Colorado and liberal members to change sides whenever it proved advantageous, much as in post-Civil War Gringolandia. While the Colorados reinforced their monopoly on power and spoils, liberals called for reform. Internecine politicking and jockeying occupied the political class of Paraguay from 1887 to 1904, and is beyond our interest. In conclusion, the modern capitalist era of the 20th century got underway then with the liberal revolution of 1904. In 1880, Caballero had seized power in a bloodless coup and dominated Paraguayan politics for most of the next 2 decades, either as president or through his power in the army. His accession to power is notable because he brought political stability, founded the Colorado Party, the new Colorado Party in 1887, to regulate the choice of presidents and the distribution of spoils, and began a process of economic reconstruction. Then we have the Liberal Party era that goes from 1904 to 1936. This is of special interest to us because this is the time in which Leninism arrives in Paraguay for the first time. The Liberal Revolution of August 1904 began as a popular movement, but Liberal Party rule quickly degenerated into even more internecine politicking, political jockeying, factional feuding, military coups, and civil wars. Political instability was extreme in the liberal era, which saw 21 governments in 36 years. During the period 1904 to 1922, Paraguay had 15 presidents. Well, the 1904 revolution, the Liberal Revolution, was organized in Buenos Aires by Manuel J. Duarte, an Argentine naval officer, and the fighting ended on December 12, 1904, when Escura resigned and a temporary president, Juan Bautista Gauna from the Liberal Party, was sworn in as the new president on December 19, 1904. 2 years later, on November 25th of 1906, the old liberal hero, General Benigno Ferreira, was then elected to the presidency. And this led to the Civil War of 1912. By 1908, the liberal radicales had overthrown General Ferreira and the Cívicos. They had disbanded Caballero's army when they came to power and organized a completely new one. Nevertheless, by 1910, Army Commander Colonel Albino Jara felt strong enough to stage a coup against President Manuel Gondra. Jara's coup was followed by 2 years where every political group seized power at least once and led to the Civil War of 1912. The Radicales again invaded from Argentina, and when the charismatic Eduardo Scherer became president, Gondra returned as Minister of War to reorganize the army once more. Scherer became the first president since Egusquiza to finish his 4-year term. Back at it again, we have the Paraguayan Civil War of 1922 to 1923. Now, the new political calm was shattered, however, when the Radicales split into Scherer and Gondra factions. Gondra won the presidential elections in 1920, but the Schereristas undermined his power and forced him to resign. We have the full-scale Paraguayan Civil War of 1922-23 between the factions. And it broke out in May of 22 and lasted for 14 months and ended with the Gondristas beating the Schereristas decisively and then holding on to power until 1936. Now, liberal policies had permitted a handful of latifundistas to total master-serf feudal control over the countryside. Farming families had no land, and U.S. and U.K. agribusiness caps manipulated Paraguay's economic fortunes. The liberals, like the Colorados, were a political oligarchy maintaining an oppressive master-serf social system in the countryside throughout the 1930s, so the stage was set for revolution. The gringos intervened again, this time over oil. The Chaco War is an imperialist war fought by surrogates. Paraguay's dispute with Bolivia over the Chaco had been brewing for decades. Poor diplomacy had prevented the settling of boundaries between the two countries during the century following independence, and although Paraguay had held the Chaco for as long as anyone could remember, the country did little to do what capitalist imperialist ideologists expected anyone with any sense to do, namely to develop, quote-unquote, the area. Now, the situation was further complicated because there were Mennonite colonies now, along with Native American peoples on the Chaco. And Bolivia's claim to the Chaco became more strident after it lost its seacoast, the Atacama Desert, to Chile during the 1879-84 imperialist Pacific War. Now, we have discussed those events several times before in this textbook and do not need to do so again now, except to say that Bolivia was without any outlet to the sea. Accordingly, Bolivian latifundistas and Germinal capitalists now wanted to absorb the Chaco and expand its territory up to the Rio Paraguay in order to gain a river port. Now, John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company had discovered oil on the Bolivian Altiplano in the 1920s. Geologically, at that time, it seemed as if this would extend to what was now Paraguay, and thus the gringo regime, always a Rockefeller puppet in matters of oil, got involved in Paraguay. Rutherford B. Hayes had an entire department in Paraguay named after him from the first gringo invasion, as you may recall. So now the U.S. was ready to go into that sorry land once more. South America's two greatest victims of war and annexation in the previous century were ready to face each other in another bout of bloody combat, this time over a piece of apparently worthless, desolate wilderness, and this time both countries as the surrogates of gringo imperialism. The Chaco Issue. In 1920, Bolivians began building forts with German guns in the Paraguayan Chaco. German military advisors soon came gringo style to train and lead their forces. In 1928, the Bolivian army established Fort Vanguardia on the Rio Paraguay. So on December 28, Paraguayan Colonel Rafael Franco attacked and destroyed it. Bolivians eventually became organized and took two Paraguayan forts. Both sides mobilized, but the liberal government surrendered de facto and agreed to the humiliating condition of rebuilding Fort Vanguardia for the Bolivians and forcing Colonel Franco to retire from the army. Now, we come to the question of unions, anarchism, and Bolshevism in Paraguay. As had been the case in the rest of the Southern Cone, the anarcho-syndicalist movement of European origins created the first unions in Paraguay, The Partido Comunista Paraguayo, or the Paraguayan Communist Party CPP, was then founded on February 19, 1928, and it was soon recognized as a section of the Communist International. But in these early years of the 20th century, the war between the Bolsheviks and the anarcho-syndicalists was as intense in Paraguay as it was in Argentina and Brazil. The anarchists demanding that only resistance groups be built to vie with the capitalists, and that the state would never have any right to interfere in any workers' organizations. The PCP Bolsheviks demanding that the workers create their own armed units to seize state power in an armed struggle with the regime, and of course advocated the state intervening everywhere. Uruguay was taking the path of Peronism before Perón, and thus was unique in this part of the world in avoiding this anarcho-syndicalist versus Bolshevism war to the finish. Now, back at the World Ranch in 1930, diplomats from Gringolandia, the League of Nations, and Argentina conducted reconciliation talks. Colonel José Félix Estigarribia, Paraguay's deputy army commander, ordered his troops into action against Bolivian positions early in 1931, and the National Independent League, Liga Nacional Independiente, was formed in 1928 by a group of intellectuals advocating a new era in national life, an era that would witness Paraguay's political and social rebirth. The League reflected a genuine popular wish for social change, and in October 1931, government troops fired on League students demonstrating in front of the government palace, and in so doing, the Liberal Party government of President José Gugiari was doomed. There followed the 1932 to 1935 war, featuring treason and the liberal downfall. Bolivia began its war against Paraguay in July 32, confident of a rapid victory. However, in the event, the highly motivated Paraguayans knew the geography of the Chaco and infiltrated Bolivian lines, surrounded their outposts, and captured their supplies. Conversely, the Bolivian army was based on unhappy, recalcitrant, conscripted Indians who had no real interest in the war. Long supply, insufficient, and unfair weak logistics pissed them off further, and the bad roads did not help their situation either. Paraguayan President Eusebio Ayala and Colonel Estigarribia worked well together and whipped the invaders at Campo Villa in December 33, a year and a half later. Now, President Ayala managed to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory, betraying the cause and agreeing to a truce. Now, this shameful truce allowed the Bolivians to regroup and was the obvious product of chicanery, the president having been suborned by large bags of money. The war continued until July 35, but Ayala's liberal government that had won the war when the treasonous truce went into effect was finished politically. Lessons of the Chaco War were catalytic to a process of unification of the political opposition with workers and peasants. It was the mass of farmers and their incipient proletarian brothers who had furnished the raw material for war and were now emerging as a social revolution. After the 1935 truce, thousands of soldiers were discharged, and these soldiers had shared the dangers and trials of the battlefield. They were deeply resentful of the ineptitude and incompetence of the Liberal Party government, not to mention its ultimate betrayal of their cause, and they had witnessed the miserable state of the Paraguayan army in the beginning and often forced to face the enemy with machetes. After what they had been through, partisan political differences seemed irrelevant. They were more than ready for the broad front with the farmers and workers. In 1936, the crisis deepened when the government offended the Army rank and file by refusing to fund pensions for disabled war veterans, and at the same time it awarded 1,500 gold pesos a year to Colonel Estigarribia. Although Estigarribia had won the final battle, he was also responsible for the terrible state of readiness at the beginning, a beginning overcome only by the great sacrifices of the people's soldiery. The process goes to completion. Colonel Franco, back on active duty since 1932, became the focus of the patriotic rebels, so when he was exiled for criticizing Ayala, the nation revolted, and on February 17th of 1936, units of the army descended on the presidential palace, seized Ayala and forced him to resign, ending 32 years of liberal rule. This was called the February Revolution. Soldiers, veterans, students, and others of the February Revolution who had revolted knew that the victory over Bolivia had come despite the liberal government, not because of it, and they brought Colonel Rafael Franco to power to begin anew, and during 18 months of existence, the Franco government showed that it was serious about social justice by expropriating more than 200,000 hectares of land and distributing it to 10,000 peasant families. And in addition, the new government guaranteed workers the right to organize their own party and unions and the right to strike, and it agreed to a law establishing an 8-hour workday in shops and factories. The government erased 7 decades of national shame when Colonel Franco declared President Francisco Solano Lopez a national hero sine exemplar without preceding example. Why? Because Solano Lopez had stood up to the foreign invasion. An official delegation was sent to Cerro Cura to find his remains. This search party was successful, or at least said it was, so that his remains, along with those of his father, were buried in the National Pantheon of the Heroes, Asunción's Arlington National Cemetery. A monument to him still stands on Asunción's highest hill. Now, the revolution divides. Fascism comes to Paraguay. In March 1936, the fascist decree law number 152 was published. It promised a change like those then occurring in Europe. Protests erupted among the left of his party, as it was obvious Franco was going down the road of Mussolini, Hitler, and Francisco Franco. Youthful, idealistic left populist elements that had come together to produce the Movimiento Februarista, or MF, the February movement, but the MF was never more than a hodgepodge of conflicting political tendencies and social opposites. Franco's cabinet reflected almost every conceivable shade of dissident political opinion, included socialists, fascist sympathizers, nationals, colorados, and liberal cívicos. He had no party organizational basis to make this transformation to totalitarianism possible, and events soon proved this. In November 1936, Franco founded the Unión Nacional Revolucionario, the Revolutionary National Union. Although the new party called for representative democracy, rights for peasants and workers, and nationalization of the most important industries, it was clearly phalangist in nature, and thus he failed to broaden his political base. But in the end, Franco lost his popular support because he failed to keep his promises to the poor. And when push came to shove, he did not dare to expropriate the properties of the great latifundista families and, of course, the foreign landowners. Gringos and Argentines were too powerful to alienate. Liberals still had influential support in the army and agitated constantly for Franco's overthrow. When Franco ordered Paraguayan troops to abandon the advanced positions in the Chaco that they'd held since the 1935 truce, the army revolted, but the revolt was a half-hearted affair. In August 1937, although nominally the liberals were back, the army did not have unified opinion about the Februaristas. Several attempted coups served to remind President Felix Paiva, the former dean of law of the National University, that although the February Revolution was out of power, it was far from dead, and people learned that the liberals had learned nothing from their time in opposition, and proof of that came when a new peace treaty was signed with Bolivia on July 21, 1938. The treaty fixed the final boundaries behind the Paraguayan battle lines. Now, in March 19th of 1939, the liberal politicians picked General Jose Felix Estigarribia as their presidential candidate. Now, you may remember, now this is the date at which the Republican government was finally sacked in Spain. Franco-fascists came to power, and the Second World War was only months away for England, and only a year and a half away for us. And at any rate, Estigarribia was the Gringo candidate, and at that moment he was the hero of the Chaco War, having served as ambassadorial envoy to Gringolandia, handpicked by the U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull to perform the mission upon behalf of the Paraguayan government. Now remember now that the Asuncion regime was a puppet regime of the USA instead of fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, or fascist Franco Spain, and that was the whole point. Cordell Hull told Estigarribia, "You're our guy. We're not going to let these Germans or Italians or fascist Francoites into your country anymore, so you're going to go down there and do what we tell you to do." So on June 13th, 1939, Paraguayan President-designate Jose Felix Estigarribia and U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull signed an Export-Import Bank of $3.5 million US, and this funded Estigarribia and accordingly greatly increased U.S. influence in his country. FDR et al. Were preparing for war and actively getting rid of Nazi and Italian fascist sympathizers, and of course Franco guys too, in Paraguay. And there was a shitload of them. So on August 15, 1939, Estigarribia assumed the presidency, and he was instructed on how to behave by the U.S. ambassador from then on throughout the course of the Second World War. And among other things, he was told to continue many ideas of the February Revolution to ensure social peace, and this included bringing communists into his support base and into his government. Accordingly, Estigarribia began a land reform that promised a small plot of land to every Paraguayan family. He reopened the university, then he implemented monetary and municipal reforms, balanced the budget, financed the public debt, increased the capital of the Central Bank of Paraguay, and drew up plans to build highways and public works, all of this financed with loans from the U.S. as needed. Estigarribia faced sharp criticism, of course, from the conservative Catholic intellectuals. The Vatican was still aligned with the fascists in Italy and Spain, and of course with Hitler. Needless to say, their Paraguayan latifundista clients hated Estigarribia and Gringolandia in equal amounts, the latter far too left for them. An official Catholic Church newspaper, El Tiempo, took the point. Anti-Estigarribia Februarista student activists from the university joined them. Anti-government demonstrations broke out in Asuncion, but the army soon suppressed them and then arrested Catholic and Februarista leaders, and this led withdrawal of Colorado support for Estigarribia, and an attempted coup on February 14, 1940 broke out at the Campo Grande military base, but the Gringo alliance was irreversible, and on that same day the U.S. ambassador said, quote, "I don't have time for this," unquote, and he instructed Estigarribia to establish a temporary dictatorship, which he did on February 18, 1940, 4 days later. Now, the Constitution promised a strong but not despotic president and a new state power to deal directly with social and economic problems. I'm going to stop right here because what we're heading to is the last part of Paraguayan history, where we're going to have the emergence of, after the Second World War, of General Stroessner, Paraguay's homegrown Nazi leader, and then the struggle which eventually brings the left-wing leader, former priest Lugo, to power, who is then subsequently overthrown by the CIA and a new guy put into power. So we'll take that all up in a subsequent lecture, which is going to be the third one in this particular series.